folks. Welcome to the week 3 session. I know it is not technically a live session, but I appreciate every single one of you for your grace and allowing me to be a little delayed this week. So thank you very much for being patient with me. I wanted to get this session up for you as soon as possible so we could get you ready and prepared to take your quizzes this week, to participate in the discussion and all that good stuff. So on my agenda for today, a couple of things. I just want to review some of the week 2 grading. There were just a handful of you that had some deductions taken in your quiz. I left a few notes for people if you want to resubmit those assignments for a higher grade, or those questions for a higher grade, I should say. You are absolutely welcome to do that. You can ask for me to reopen and you can fix the answer, or you can send it to me in Outlook or via the course chat, whichever works, and I will be happy to get that score for you. I have also had several of you reaching out, responding to my outreach. It's just good to know what's going on with you so that I know how best to tell, the people who are asking me what's going on with so-and-so in your class. Well, I don't know, they won't respond. So those of you that have taken the time to respond and let me know where you're at, thank you. I appreciate that. It helps me a lot. I am super interested in you passing this course. So whatever you need from me in order to make that happen, let's talk about it. I'm very open to suggestions and working with you in a way that will be helpful for you personally. I know that we are all dealing with so many things, and school is an extra thing you've taken on, and that can sometimes be hard to balance. So sometimes we need a little grace from each other, like with this live session. I'm happy to give you grace where you've given me grace. So also, I did send you that note to let you know about the delay in the live session. When I logged in this morning, I found it sent to most of you like 5 times. So super sorry about that. Did not mean to spam your inbox. Wanted to make sure you got the note, and boy, howdy did you. So all right, let me think. Anything else from week 2 that I wanted to talk to you about? I don't think so. I think we're all good to go. All of your grades should be in. I've been keeping an eye on the lates, trying to get those turned around as quickly as possible. So the grade you see should be pretty current, good to go for you. Okay. So today, right at the top of the session, per usual, we're going to review last week's material, just a quick recap on listening from chapter 3, and then we will jump into the chapter 4 content, which is all about verbal and nonverbal messaging and communication, how they're the same, how they're different, some various types that we use, why they're important, things like that. So let me turn off my camera and we will get right into it. All right, so we are reviewing chapter 3 first. This was our section on listening. Remember that when you are listening, you need to be listening to understand, and that requires a few things. That means withholding judgment, not interrupting, asking for feedback and clarification, things like that. There are a lot of faulty assumptions that we make when we are listening. Our interpretation, remember the slide about the joker, when we assume what the other person is talking about, we cannot understand it effectively. Listening is the most frequently used activity, especially at work. Being a good listener helps you be better in your role and helps your company out. It is a skill that a lot of employers want. And there are plenty of different styles of listening based on, the situations you're in, the people you're interacting with. Make sure you understand relational, analytical, task-oriented, and critical listening. And also, I want you to understand how your style could be different from the person you're talking to's style. What kind of impact might that have on your communication, right? Could there be any barriers? And speaking of barriers, there are so many barriers that keep us from being good listeners. Keep in mind physiological and psychological barriers like being preoccupied or stressed or overloaded. Things like your ego, I don't want to look stupid, that all can interfere with effective listening. And then remember that the best and my favorite part of the listening process is evaluation. Listening should always be evaluative. Remember, judge everyone. Be like Thor's hammer. Analyze the speaker and their evidence and any sort of bias or loaded language they're using in order to be more effective. Okay, so that's the recap on the listening chapter. Let's jump into chapter 4, verbal and nonverbal communication. Um, so I want to start with verbal. What is verbal communication? Well, verbal communication is pretty much all of the words coming out of your mouth, right? Um, we see a lot of conflict surrounding verbal communication. Uh, the reason that happens is that we find conflict occurring when people have incompatible goals, opposing viewpoints, things like that. And conflict can be expressed verbally or non-verbally. There's a huge continuum in conflict management, right? So it's really important that you understand when we're talking about verbal communication and conflict. I want you to know misunderstandings and conflict, fact of life. They're going to happen. Um, because of the wide variety of interpretation that is possible with communication. Two people can absolutely hear the same message and interpret it differently. Even the most basic, simple terms can be confused, leading to more conflict. The other thing I want you to know when we're talking about conflict as a piece of your verbal communication skill set, conflict isn't always a negative. Okay. And it is definitely not always unproductive. In fact, there are plenty of studies that show quantity of conflict in the relationship is not nearly as important as how that conflict is handled. So you can have two different couples, right? One couple fights every single day, and at the end of the day, they talk it through and they work it out. And then you have the other couple who never fights about anything. Well, the science would tell us that the first couple is actually a healthier couple because proper handling of conflict in a relationship is really what makes it qualitative. Okay. Um, Now, conflict is present in our personal lives. It's also going to be present in our professional lives. It's really important that you develop the communication skill set to manage your conflict, especially at work, and to negotiate really good outcomes so that you can be successful in the workplace. And I'll tell you that when you learn how to manage conflict in your personal life, um, you will be better at it in your professional life. So working on these skills, it's going to help you in a variety of ways. Okay. So there's a couple of things that we can do to ensure our verbal communication is clear and to help minimize conflict. And the first one is using clarity and avoiding ambiguity. So when you are using your verbal messaging, you want to use nice, clear language. Okay. Now there are two different types of terms I want you to know: equivocal and unequivocal terms. So equivocal terms are the kinds of terms that have two different but both common or acceptable meanings, right? So these are the kinds of terms that arise when we're having kind of a casual conversation and then there's a slight confusion and then you realize you or maybe the other person has interpreted them differently. Think about like the Joker example. Those are equivocal terms. There's also an unequivocal term, so things that have a very concrete meaning, right? When you are communicating, particularly in the workplace, you want to make sure your terms are as unequivocal as possible. because equivocal misunderstandings can absolutely arise. And the best way to avoid them is to choose your words very carefully. Okay. And in that vein, we need to talk about abstractions. There's something called a low level abstraction and a high level abstraction. Okay. Um, Low level, these are really, really concrete statements. So they're very little left up to interpretation. Then you have high level abstractions, which are much broader, far fewer details, right? So imagine if we're having a conversation and I use an equivocal term with a high level abstraction. How much conflict could potentially arise from that? How much miscommunication could arise? A lot. When you're in the workplace, I want to encourage you to use unequivocal and low level terms to keep all of your meaning as clear as possible. I want to talk to you a little bit about jargon. Jargon is sort of like your workplace vocabulary. Every single profession, from your waitresses all the way up to your academic educators, has its own special vocabulary that is used, and that is called jargon. Sometimes when we are communicating to coworkers, we will use these words to save time, right? However, when you are communicating outside of the workplace, you have to be careful with your jargon. Um, there is some value and strategy involved when you are using your workplace jargon. For example, if I use just a little bit of jargon in a daily conversation, I might impress my listeners, but it's not gonna help them understand what I'm talking about any better. It's just gonna be kind of an ego thing, right? Um, but if I'm using jargon at work and the speakers or excuse me, the listeners are completely unaware of what I'm talking about, they kind of shift, right? They go on to focus on what is this person trying to tell me instead of the message I'm actually trying to communicate. So you need to be careful with jargon. A couple of examples, like in the waitress example, you can say things like, um, I've 86'd an item from the menu. You've been sat. I've got a high top. Watch out for campers. If you were a waitress, you would know everything I just said. Okay. Those are all jargon. In the education field, we have things like andragogy and pedagogy. What are your uh, educational modalities and which Bloom's level are you looking at, right? Those are all educational pieces of jargon. And I'm sure that most of you folks out there, because you work in specialized industries, have your own set of jargon. Think about all the medical terminology and the abbreviations that get used in your workplace. All of that is jargon. Now, like I said, you can use that in everyday conversations to be very impressive, but your audience, unless they are also in your field, are likely not going to recognize them. Okay. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about ambiguity. Um, Ambiguity, ambiguous language. What does that mean? Well, we've talked a little bit about the different types of cultures that exist, low context and high context cultures, right? Low context cultures, like in the US, we like really direct language. You know, what is it in the text? It says, don't beat around the bush, right? So we don't want ambiguous language. We don't want it to be vague. In our culture, vague language could be seen as deceptive or misleading. Now, other cultures, high context cultures, for example, they have sort of operationalized being strategic in their language, strategic ambiguity, finding ways to express difficult messages in a more indirect way. Okay. When you're in the workplace, I want you to consider, when is ambiguous language beneficial? Excuse me, beneficial, and when could it be harmful or a barrier to your communication? I like the idea of using ambiguous language strategically. And in fact, the higher up sort of in the employment food chain, the more ambiguous you're allowed to be. For example, when I was just starting out teaching, I would be very, very to the point, right? And then the higher up in the system I got, I realized I can't say everything exactly like it is. There's people who need to know certain things and people who don't. And so I have to work that art of strategic ambiguity. So consider these factors in your verbal communication, particularly in the workplace. I want you to pay attention to the idea of inflammatory language. Basically, language, the words we use, they have power, right? Language has the power to create an emotional response. And that can be good or bad. You can be motivated or inspired, or you can laugh and be hilarious. But then on the other side of that coin, the language you choose can have negative outcomes. People can feel defensive or, discriminated against. So I want you to understand how language makes a difference. Avoid biased language or terms that seem to be objective but conceal emotional bias. Okay. You've got to be aware that all of your language is going to be put through the lens that you have, through your own experiences, your own thoughts and opinions. When you're in the workplace, you have to take a minute to consider your words. If you say something loaded with a bias, that could be considered inflammatory and that could really cause some waves in the workplace. I've seen poor language choices cause terminations, things like that. Super important to be aware of. I want you to be aware of trigger words. Now, I know there's sort of a kind of social thing going on with snowflakes and being triggered and all of that stuff. But before hashtag triggered was even a thing, we knew in communication, we knew about trigger words. There are certain words that, when used, elicit an emotional response in just about everybody. Um, think about the difference between me saying, that person is disabled versus that person is crippled, right? Two words. The latter, it can be seen as, having a very negative connotation. There might be an emotional association with it. It can be a big deal, right? Um, so consider the words you choose. Choose your words wisely, I should say. I want you to understand that how you speak influences how other people perceive you. There's a lot of things for you to think about when you are considering your own identity management. The language and the words you use create an image. You want that image to be reflective of what you're really going for. Do you want to be seen as the high power, high class boss who has it all put together? Well, your language had better reflect that. If you want to be seen as an open, caring, maybe maternal type of boss, then use the language that helps create that image, right? You can shape and choose your identity based on the language choices you make. Okay. Now, the language you choose has power, and more than just what I mentioned about your image, but language choices can create an air of confidence, right? Think about powerful language, clear, precise, no fillers, no extra, verbs or adjectives. When people, and I do this all the time, so I'm the worst at following my own advice, as is everyone. But when people say it's super, super important, I'm like, how old are we? Super. But I do the same thing. I'm super guilty of. There it is. I just did it. Oh man, an example in real time. It doesn't show that I'm maybe not confident in that idea, but it does create an image, right? That I'm maybe less formal than I want to be. Would I use the term "it's super important" at a board meeting? I hope not. I probably would, but as long as I own that image that's created, I suppose that's what it is, right? Um, so use language well. There are things, there are language and terms that is positive and negative, right? Um, and there are ways you can respond to communication that are both positive and negative. There's a really good example in your book. Um, like if the boss comes in and says, it's the end of the day, you got 15 minutes before you're leaving, and the boss says, hey, I need this done right now. There are two ways you can respond. You can say, I can't get to it tonight. And then you could also say, I would be happy to get to it first thing tomorrow. Now you're essentially giving the same outcome and saying the same thing, but it's all in the phrasing. If I say, I can't do it tonight, I can't, negative. I'm happy to get to that first thing tomorrow, positive, right? So consider that positive language. And be aware of your disfluencies. Disfluencies are filler words, those things that add nothing to a statement, but we all use them as sort of like adapters or regulators, like the ums, the you knows, the likes. If you have a fantastic presentation of very well thought out ideas and evidence and proof and solutions, but the way you speak comes across with a lot of uh that type of disfluency affects your identity management. You look less competent and you look less persuasive, which is probably not what you're going for. They're very hard to get rid of. All right. And I don't expect any of you will be perfect at it right off the bat, but it's something to be aware of. Now, I would be remiss to not mention how gender affects communication, your verbal communication particularly. Um, in the textbook, we talk about male and female speech, but understand that when we're talking about male and female speech, we're not necessarily talking about gender or sex. We're talking more about masculine and feminine communication styles or language styles. So although your textbook leans on the words male and female, I'm going to use masculine and feminine because those are way better adjectives to describe different styles rather than having anything to do with gender or sex, right? Um, for example, I'm sure I've told you I have a very masculine language style, but I am a woman, so it wouldn't really fit. So I'm going to use these terms instead, okay? So feminine language style is all about creating a rapport, creating a connection, showing support, building a community, right? Um, for a lot of people with this language style, they will use it to be expressive and articulate, right? To give relational communications, to listen to and respond all of to the unspoken conversational clues, the nonverbal communication. It questions, it prods, and sometimes exhibits a less powerful approach. Um, we also see a lot of negatives in feminine communication styles. We see a lot of apologizing, which affects the image. It affects your authority and your status, right? But it's not a weak language style. It's just a little more withdrawn and more all about the kind of right brain, emotional side of the spectrum. And masculine language style does just the opposite. It refers to more report, less feelings, more information, facts, knowledge, showing competence. A lot of this language style has to do with getting attention or asserting a position or establishing a solution. Whereas feminine will use language expressively, masculine uses it as an instrument or operationally a tool to get things done, right? So masculine speech is always considered a little more assertive and authoritative. And that can be good and bad, right? I mentioned before that I have a masculine language style, but what happens when a woman has a masculine language style? A lot of the time I get referred to as too blunt, too direct, things like that, right? So it is what it is. It's but there are good and bad sides to all of it. And I think it's very important for us to recognize and acknowledge that there are some challenges when we incorporate the rules of gender into language. There are several different communication styles, right? Masculine and feminine language styles have a tendency to clash at work and at home. Um, and knowing that where you sit as well as where the other person you're communicating with sits is going to be super important in reaching a solution and being an effective communicator. So just because you use one style, you have to be aware other people lean on other styles. Okay. Um, you also should have a good grasp on both styles of communication so you can make switches when it's appropriate. Think about, like, if you are using your masculine communication style, talking to a feminine communicator, and you can just tell you're not on the same page, there's frustration perhaps, or a miscommunication or conflict. Could you switch styles and use that as a useful tool to be better communicators, right? Um, if your first instinct is, I'm going to support it, I'm going to be supportive and use my emotional, what about instead this time using your logical, offering advice, right? See if it works for you. Understand both well enough that you can switch between them. And always remember that effective communication doesn't have to be an either or. You don't have to choose one or the other. It's really going to be uh, a combination of both styles, and it's very contingent on the environment and the context of the situation you're in. Okay. So, verbal communication, a lot of opportunity for missed communication, a lot of things for you to think about while you're working through the materials this week. Okay. All right, let's talk about nonverbal communication. Now, most of the time when we are talking about communication, we are focusing on the words. And verbal communication, very important. Humans have relied on it for a long time. But humans have also relied on nonverbal communication for thousands of years because guess what? That developed first. um, Nonverbal communication. What is it? How can we use it? How is it the same? How is it different? Well, nonverbal communication is everything in communication that is not words. Okay. Um, Nonverbal communication tends to do the work of communicating the emotion more than verbal does. There are several pieces, several components of nonverbal similar to verbal, such as, think about in verbal communication, there are things like grammar that influences how we structure our messages, right? Well, nonverbal, we don't have any official rules that govern our nonverbals, but there's a lot of social rules. Okay. Um, Nonverbal communication is quite powerful. It's very involuntary, which has the tendency to make it more believable. Nonverbal communication is very difficult to control or to fake. I mean, I can fake a smile when I meet someone, but it's difficult to fake that I'm actually happy, if that makes sense. Nonverbal has this habit of leaking out your actual intention, right? So one thing that it's important for you to understand, we talk about verbal communication, we've talked about the channels we use to get verbal communication across. And when I say channel, I mean, like oral communication is picked up by your ears, that's the channel. Well, nonverbal communication can be taken in by 5 of our senses, right? 5, are you kidding? We are always working on it. Some of the studies I've read recently say somewhere between 65 and 90% of our communication is nonverbal. It's interesting, right? It always holds more weight. Like I said, it's much more considered much more believable. I think I've used this example before, but I'm sure you've seen someone who is maybe telling you a story or a lie, and you're like, I don't believe this, but I don't really know why. It's the nonverbals that are telling you that it's dishonest. Nonverbal communication affects your career success because it's all about listening, which we talked about last week. Nonverbal communication and what is appropriate is culturally defined, okay? And it can absolutely express our gender identity. Um, our hobbies, our passions and interests are all conveyed non-verbally by the clothes you wear, the accessories you carry, your accent, the tone of your voice. You can learn so much from nonverbal communication. So let's talk about paralanguage. Paralanguage is kind of the vocalized but nonverbal parts of the message. So think about things like vocal quality, pitch. Is it high or low? What does that communicate? Pitch generally helps communicate meaning. It regulates flow. It can communicate some intensity. I think it's your text that says babies recognize higher pitched. When you end a sentence on a high pitch, that it's a question. Babies can sort of pick up on that. Isn't that interesting? We also talk about volume. What does volume mean? Are you speaking loud? Is it soft? How do both ends of that spectrum impact communication? Well, if you're speaking too soft, I can't hear you. If you're speaking too loud, I can hear you way too well, and that's distracting too. Some other pieces of paralanguage: rate and tempo. So how fast are you speaking? Think about when you're speaking really quickly, what does that communicate to another person? Maybe that you're like a little manic. Your emotional state is a little iffy. What if you speak incredibly slow? Does that say anything about your intelligence, maybe? Right? So tempo and rate, I get that feedback a lot when I teach. You went too fast. Okay, well, that's something I do have to work on. Rate and tempo is a big piece. Okay. One thing that I don't think gets enough attention with rate and tempo is that, kind of like volume. If you are going too quickly or too slow, it interferes with your audience's ability to receive and understand your message. Okay. If you're going so slow, I will be bored. I will wonder why you're speaking so slow, and now my attention is wandering. If you're going too fast, I can't follow what you're saying. That's distracting, right? So your rate and your tempo can have a big impact on how much is understood. We talked a little bit about disfluencies already and fillers, right? Filling in the gaps when you're trying to here I go doing it again, when you're trying to think of the next thing you want to say. We learned earlier, fillers are a part of life. They can definitely help somebody kind of bridge the gap. They can also be seen as a negative in some ways, but the actual ums and ahs fall under nonverbal paralanguage. Okay. And then pauses, how frequently you're pausing, how long you are pausing. This is also considered under paralanguage and can be important in getting your message across. Now, another piece of nonverbal communication that absolutely needs to be talked about is your appearance, your physical appearance, the artifacts that you choose. Artifacts include everything you decorate yourself with. So the clothes you wear, the jewelry you wear, what accessories you carry around, okay? That all makes an impression. Think about your first impression of Wonder Woman on this page. She's wearing a gown. She's got her crown on. The gown is very low cut. You are making, whether you know it or not, you're making a first impression of her based on what she wears. Now, I know that we've probably all been taught not to judge a book by its cover, but that's kind of part of the deal with nonverbal communication and appearance. Your appearance communicates. Okay. Um, it's up to you to determine what exactly it is you want to communicate. And especially in the company culture, there can be some rules you need to follow. Remember, dress codes are put in place for a reason. They're there to remind you that, hey, you're at work, the rules are different, your demeanor should be different, you're part of a team, you represent this company. Um, they are going to tell you essentially what you should be communicating with your physical appearance. But when in doubt, always err more conservatively. Don't show up like Wonder Woman in this image to your first day in the office. And always dress for the job you want. Okay, I know that's an old adage. I even have a meme that says, I was told to dress for the job I wanted, and now I'm in a disciplinary meeting dressed as Wonder Woman, right? Well, what I mean by that is if you want to be the vice president of the company, dress like you are, okay? Because it shows initiative and it makes an impression. You can absolutely use appearance to your advantage in obtaining a certain image. We talk about presentation goals in week 1, right? This is exactly what we're talking about, okay? Let's talk about your face and your eyes. These two physical features can communicate so much non-verbally. Faces communicate emotions so clearly, and your eyes and your eye contact will communicate and indicate the level of involvement you have in the subject and the person you're speaking to. But remember that both of these factors have a cultural component, okay? Our faces are the most expressive part of our bodies. A lot of the meaning from a human face is in that expression. A lot of basic facial expressions are recognized by all sorts of cultures, right? We can almost universally recognize things like happiness or anger or sadness, okay? Those are all key emotions that, regardless of your culture, um, regardless of how you grew up, and barring any physiological or psychological deficiencies, most every human being can recognize those basic core group of emotions: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, disgust. Yes, all of the ones from the movie Inside Out. There's a reason they chose those 5 as the anchor group, right? Core group. So I want you to understand those things are universal. Your face will communicate those feelings regardless of what you want to do. All right. You will also communicate through your eye contact. Eye contact actually has its own category of nonverbal communication called oculesics, which is very cool. But we kind of lump them together because we don't need to go specifically into oculesics. What's more important for you, especially for the testing this week, is to understand that your face, your eyes, these are usually the main point of focus when you're communicating. And then your ears take in all of the next layer of communication. So your eyes and your face are communicating out, your ears are taking it in, right? Eye contact serves a lot of functions. I mentioned it indicates involvement, it regulates your interaction. We use eye contact to signal to others when we are ready to speak. So when it's our turn, okay? Think about anytime you've been sitting in class, maybe not paying attention, and the teacher looks directly at you and says, well, what do you think? And you have to like panic because you were not paying attention, right? That eye contact is killer. Eye contact is super important for you in the feedback piece of the communication process. You can also use your eye contact to be very intimidating, right? I mentioned there's a cultural piece. There's some very socially set norms and mores about how much eye contact we can make with people. based on the setting, based on the person. In some contexts, if I stare with you and I don't break eye contact, I'm being intimidating, right? In another context, I could do the same thing and I'm flirting with you. Okay. In one culture, it's seen as disrespectful. In another, it's seen as you have to do that or you are not being respectful, right? Or you have to do it to be respectful. So it's two sides of a coin. Again, eye contact is kind of one of those things you have to use. You have to read the room. Okay. Let's talk about proxemics. Proxemics refers to distance, how you use physical space to communicate. We all have sort of varying definitions of personal space based on context, relationships, right? But there are a few pieces of proxemics and personal space that are sort of universal and can communicate. So first thing I want you to think about is how space is used in an organization and what that communicates. If you have ever worked in a cubicle style workplace, I'll bet your cubicle was pretty small and the walls might have been tall, and that's designed to keep you focused, not let you get distracted. But you don't have a door on your cubicle, so you don't really have privacy. Okay, so think about what those things are communicating. Now, your boss, on the other hand, I'll bet they had an office with a door. It signifies and communicates they're more important and their privacy is sort of a protected piece of their role. Now, when you go into the boss's office and sit down at the desk to have a conversation, my gut tells me that they will be sitting on one side of the desk and their view will be everything out on the floor, right? They can see their door, they can see probably through a window what's going on out in the cubicles. However, when you are sitting in their office, all you can do is look at them. Your back will be to the door because you need to focus. You don't want to be in there wasting the boss's time. Again, his time is important. Okay. So we use space in an organization to communicate those types of things. But it's very important for you to understand how environment is shaped by proximity. We have certain levels and certain things we communicate by how close or far or proximal we allow people to us. Okay. So social scientists have sort of nailed down 4 bubbles which communicate relationship. Okay. So the first one, well, I'm going to use an example actually to talk a little bit about this. Hopefully it'll clear it up for you. So let's imagine that after class today, we're going to go over to the hotel bar and we're going to have happy hour because we've had a long week and we just want to relax. All right. So you and me, we go over to the hotel bar. Everybody in the bar around us, 12 feet and beyond, is in our public space. We don't have a relationship with them. There's nothing beyond the fact that we're all there to get a drink. No relationship is communicated in the public space. Okay. Now, because you and I know each other, we will probably be sitting near to each other and maybe leaning in a little bit to talk to each other. That would be considered the social consultative zone, 4 to 12 feet around. Okay. This is usually the professional zone, right? So you're close enough that we're communicating. You're far enough that there's no, suggestion that anything inappropriate is going on. This is a very safe zone. All right. Now, if we are sitting in the hotel bar and Jason Momoa decides to come over and make his move, which once he sees me, he's totally gonna, I might invite him into my casual personal space. Okay. A little bit closer, 18 inches to 4 feet, sort of suggests the edge of your personal bubble. I'm going to invite Jason Momoa into my personal bubble all day long because I want him to be aware that I want to be something more than social with him. I'd like to be a little more personal, and not every single person is allowed inside that kind of personal space bubble. Okay. You can also use that for close friends. Family is usually allowed in the casual personal zone, things like that. And then finally, after you and I are done with happy hour, me and Jason Momoa, no, I'm teasing. We also have intimate space, which is absolute physical contact to 18 inches away. This is the invisible line that usually only romantic and intimate partners are allowed into. You can't just walk up to anybody and get that close to them without, you know, potentially making them uncomfortable or causing a scene, right? In fact, if you were to walk right up into my intimate space, it would be a little scary. What are you doing? What do you need? What are you, right? So consider when you are using distance, these are kind of the general rules. Now, different people, because we're all individual, have very varying degrees. Okay. Just be aware that what you consider your personal space might not match up with another person. Make sure that you get consent to enter intimate space. Okay. Even if you're just friends and you want to like lean in for a hug, let's make sure everybody's okay with that before we do it. All right. And in the workplace, especially, try to stick to that social consultative zone. Keep everyone 4 to 12 feet around you. It's just a good practice. Now, how can we be better nonverbal communicators? Well, nonverbal communication receives a lot less attention than verbal, okay? Especially in our everyday lives. So I think it's important to spend a lot of time on it here in class, because learning more about nonverbal communication, becoming more aware of our own and of others, help us be better partners and better professionals, big time. So I want you to think about all of the stages and all of the different pieces of communication, encoding, decoding, things like that. Where does nonverbal communication sit? Okay. Now, once you figure out what stage of the communication process we're talking about, you have to improve your confidence through awareness. So you have to monitor your own nonverbals. Remember, nonverbals can complement, enhance, or contradict each other. There are some social norms, especially around touch and personal space, which vary between like a personal context and a professional context, all very important. But you have to monitor what you're doing before you know how to be aware of it and fix it, okay? You need to pay attention to others, show an interest in others' nonverbal communications. Pay attention to who particularly seems to get really good results with nonverbal communications. Anybody you know that's like a killer boss, or a really good listener, things like that. Watch what they're doing. You can always match intensity, okay? Observe conventions. What's common, what's appropriate, what's socially acceptable. Ask questions when in doubt, okay? Now, I want to show you this TED Talk, but it's a little bit long. I may just have to post it in the, I'm worried because I don't want to run out of time here. Nope, we're going to do it. Let me make sure my sound is shared. Hold on. Share my sound. There we go. So this is Amy Cuddy. This is a TED Talk called Your Body Language May Shape Who You Are. This is an important one for me because I think so much attention gets placed on verbal communication. We have weeks about verbal communication. This one really talks about how nonverbal communication is important. So let's see, it says 21 minutes.
So I want to start by offering you a free, no-tech life hack. And all it requires of you is this, that you change your posture for 2 minutes. But before I give it away, I want to ask you to right now do a little audit of your body and what you're doing with your body. So how many of you are sort of making yourselves smaller? Maybe you're hunching, crossing your legs, maybe wrapping your ankles. Sometimes we hold on to our arms like this. Sometimes we spread out. I see you. So I want you to pay attention to what you're doing right now. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes, and I'm hoping that if you sort of learn to tweak this a little bit, it could significantly change the way your life unfolds. So we're really fascinated with body language, and we're particularly interested in other people's body language. You know, we're interested in, like, you know, an awkward interaction or a smile or a contemptuous glance or maybe a very awkward wink or maybe even something like a handshake.
Here they are arriving at number 10 and look at this lucky policeman gets to shake hands with the President of the United States. Oh, and here comes the Prime Minister of it. No.
So a handshake or the lack of a handshake can have us talking for weeks and weeks and weeks, even the BBC and the New York Times. So obviously, when we think about nonverbal behavior or body language, but we call it nonverbals as social scientists, it's language. So we think about communication. When we think about communication, we think about interactions. So what is your body language communicating to me? What's mine communicating to you? And there's a lot of reason to believe that this is a valid way to look at this. So social scientists have spent a lot of time looking at the effects of our body language or other people's body language on judgments. And we make sweeping judgments and inferences from body language. And those judgments can predict really meaningful life outcomes like who we hire or promote, who we ask out on a date. For example, Nalini Ambady, a researcher at Tufts University, shows that when people watch 30-second soundless clips of real physician-patient interactions, their judgments of the physician's niceness predict whether or not that physician will be sued. So it doesn't have to do so much with whether or not that physician was incompetent, but do we like that person and how they interacted? Even more dramatic, Alex Todorov at Princeton has shown us that judgments of political candidates' faces in just 1 second predict 70% of US Senate and gubernatorial race outcomes. And even, let's go digital, emoticons used well in online negotiations can lead you to claim more value from that negotiation. If you use them poorly, bad idea, right? So when we think of nonverbals, we think of how we judge others, how they judge us, and what the outcomes are. We tend to forget, though, the other audience that's influenced by our nonverbals, and that's ourselves. We are also influenced by our nonverbals, our thoughts and our feelings and our physiology. So what nonverbals am I talking about? I'm a social psychologist, I study prejudice, and I teach at a competitive business school. So it was inevitable that I would become interested in power dynamics. I became especially interested in nonverbal expressions of power and dominance. And what are nonverbal expressions of power and dominance? Well, this is what they are. So in the animal kingdom, they are about expanding. So you make yourself big, you stretch out, you take up space, you're basically opening up. It's about opening up. And this is true across the animal kingdom. It's not just limited to primates, and humans do the same thing. So they do this both when they have power sort of chronically, and also when they're feeling powerful in the moment. And this one is especially interesting because it really shows us how universal and old these expressions of power are. This expression, which is known as pride, Jessica Tracy has studied, she shows that people who are born with sight and people who are congenitally blind do this when they win at a physical competition. So when they cross the finish line and they've won, it doesn't matter if they've never seen anyone do it, they do this. So the arms up in the V, the chin is slightly lifted. What do we do when we feel powerless? We do exactly the opposite. We close up, we wrap ourselves up, we make ourselves small. We don't want to bump into the person next to us. So again, both animals and humans do the same thing. And this is what happens when you put together high and low power. So what we tend to do when it comes to power is that we complement the other's nonverbals. So if someone's being really powerful with us, we tend to make ourselves smaller. We don't mirror them, we do the opposite of them. So I'm watching this behavior in the classroom, and what do I notice? I notice that MBA students really exhibit the full range of power nonverbals. So you have people who are like caricatures of alphas, like really coming into the room. They get right into the middle of the room before class even starts, like they really want to occupy space. When they sit down, they're sort of spread out. They raise their hands like this. You have other people who are virtually collapsing when they come in. As soon as they come in, you see it. You see it on their faces and their bodies, and they sit in their chair and they make themselves tiny, and they go like this when they raise their hand. I noticed a couple things about this. One, you're not going to be surprised. It seems to be related to gender. So women are much more likely to do this kind of thing than men. Women feel chronically less powerful than men, so this is not surprising. But the other thing I noticed is that it also seemed to be related to the extent to which the students were participating and how well they were participating. And this is really important in the MBA classroom because participation counts for half the grade. So business schools have been struggling with its gender grade gap. You get these equally qualified women and men coming in, and then you get these differences in grades, and it seems to be partly attributable to participation. So I started to wonder, okay, so you have these people coming in like this, and they're participating. Is it possible that we could get people to fake it, and would it lead them to participate more? So my main collaborator, Dana Carney, who's at Berkeley, and I really wanted to know, can you fake it till you make it? Like, can you do this just for a little while and actually experience a behavioral outcome that makes you seem more powerful? So we know that our nonverbals govern how other people think and feel about us. There's a lot of evidence, but our question really was, do our nonverbals govern how we think and feel about ourselves? There's some evidence that they do. So, for example, when we smile when we feel happy, but also when we're forced to smile by holding a pen in our teeth like this, it makes us feel happy. So it goes both ways. When it comes to power, it also goes both ways. So when you feel powerful, you're more likely to do this, but it's also possible that when you pretend to be powerful, you are more likely to actually feel powerful. So the second question really was, so we know that our minds change our bodies, but is it also true that our bodies change our minds? And when I say minds, in the case of the powerful, what am I talking about? So I'm talking about thoughts and feelings and the sort of physiological things that make up our thoughts and feelings. And in my case, that's hormones. I look at hormones. So what do the minds of the powerful versus the powerless look like? So powerful people tend to be, not surprisingly, more assertive and more confident, more optimistic. They actually feel that they're going to win even at games of chance. They also tend to be able to think more abstractly. So there are a lot of differences. They take more risks. There are a lot of differences between powerful and powerless people. Physiologically, there also are differences on two key hormones, testosterone, which is the dominance hormone, and cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So what we find is that high-power alpha males in primate hierarchies have high testosterone and low cortisol. And powerful and effective leaders also have high testosterone and low cortisol. So what does that mean? When you think about power, people tended to think only about testosterone because that was about dominance. But really, power is also about how you react to stress. So do you want the high-power leader that's dominant, high on testosterone, but really stress reactive? Probably not, right? You want the person who's powerful and assertive and dominant, but not very stress reactive, the person who's laid back. So we know that in primate hierarchies, if an alpha needs to take over, if an individual needs to take over an alpha role sort of suddenly, within a few days, that individual's testosterone has gone up significantly and his cortisol has dropped significantly. So we have this evidence, both that the body can shape the mind, at least at the facial level, and also that role changes can shape the mind. So what happens, okay, you take a role change, what happens if you do that at a really minimal level, like this tiny manipulation, this tiny intervention? For 2 minutes, you say, I want you to stand like this, and it's going to make you feel more powerful. So this is what we did. We decided to bring people into the lab and run a little experiment. And these people adopted for 2 minutes either high power poses or low power poses. And I'm just going to show you 5 of the poses, although they took on only 2. So here's one, a couple more. This one has been dubbed the Wonder Woman by the media. Here are a couple more. So you can be standing or you can be sitting. And here are the low power poses. So you're folding up, you're making yourself small. This one is very low power. When you're touching your neck, you're really kind of protecting yourself. So this is what happens. They come in, they spit into a vial. We, for 2 minutes, say, you need to do this or this. They don't look at pictures of the poses. We don't want to prime them with the concept of power. We want them to be feeling power, right? So 2 minutes they do this. We then ask them, how powerful do you feel on a series of items? And then we give them an opportunity to gamble. And then we take another saliva sample. That's it. That's the whole experiment. So this is what we find. Risk tolerance, which is the gambling. What we find is that when you're in the high power pose condition, 86% of you will gamble. When you're in the low power pose condition, only 60%. And that's a pretty whopping significant difference. Here's what we find on testosterone. From their baseline when they come in, high power people experience about a 20% increase, and low power people experience about a 10% decrease. So again, 2 minutes and you get these changes. Here's what you get on cortisol. High power people experience about a 25% decrease, and the low power people experience about a 15% increase. So 2 minutes lead to these hormonal changes that configure your brain to basically be either assertive, confident, and comfortable, or really stress reactive, and feeling sort of shut down. And we've all had that feeling, right? So it seems that our nonverbals do govern how we think and feel about ourselves. So it's not just others, but it's also ourselves. Also, our bodies change our minds. But the next question, of course, is, can power posing for a few minutes really change your life in meaningful ways? So this is in the lab, it's this little task, it's just a couple of minutes. Where can you actually apply this, which we cared about, of course. And so we think it's really what matters, where you want to use this is evaluative situations, like social threat situations. Where are you being evaluated? Either by your friends, like for teenagers, it's at the lunchroom table. It could be, for some people, it's speaking at a school board meeting. It might be giving a pitch, or giving a talk like this, or doing a job interview. We decided that the one that most people could relate to, because most people had been through, was the job interview. So we published these findings, and the media are all over it, and they say, okay, so this is what you do when you go in for the job interview, right? So we were, of course, horrified and said, oh my God, no, that's not what we meant at all, for numerous reasons. No, don't do that. Again, this is not about you talking to other people, it's you talking to yourself. What do you do before you go into a job interview? You do this. Right? You're sitting down, you're looking at your iPhone or your Android, not trying to leave anyone out. You're looking at your notes, you're hunching up, making yourself small, when really what you should be doing maybe is this, like in the bathroom, right? Do that, find 2 minutes. So that's what we want to test, okay? So we bring people into a lab, and they do either high or low power poses again. They go through a very stressful job interview. It's 5 minutes long. They are being recorded, they're being judged also, and the judges are trained to give no nonverbal feedback. So they look like this. Like, imagine this is the person interviewing you. So for 5 minutes, nothing. And this is worse than being heckled. People hate this. It's what Marianne LaFrance calls standing in social quicksand. So this really spikes your cortisol. So this is the job interview we put them through, because we really wanted to see what happened. We then have these coders look at these tapes, 4 of them. They're blind to the hypothesis, they're blind to the conditions. They have no idea who's been posing in what pose. And they end up looking at these sets of tapes, and they say, oh, we want to hire these people, all the high power posers. We don't want to hire these people. We also evaluate these people much more positively overall. But what's driving it? It's not about the content of the speech. It's about the presence that they're bringing to the speech. We also, because we rate them on all these variables related to sort of competence, like how well structured is the speech? How good is it? What are their qualifications? No effect on those things. This is what's affected, these kinds of things. People are bringing their true selves, basically. They're bringing themselves. They bring their ideas, but as themselves, with no, residue over them. So this is what's driving the effect or mediating the effect. So when I tell people about this, that our bodies change our minds and our minds can change our behavior and our behavior can change our outcomes, they say to me, it feels fake, right? So I said, fake it till you make it. It's not me. I don't want to get there and then still feel like a fraud. I don't want to feel like an imposter. I don't want to get there only to feel like I'm not supposed to be here. And that really resonated with me because I want to tell you a little story about being an imposter and feeling like I'm not supposed to be here. When I was 19, I was in a really bad car accident. I was thrown out of a car, rolled several times. I was thrown from the car, and I woke up in a head injury rehab ward, and I had been withdrawn from college, and I learned that my IQ had dropped by 2 standard deviations, which was very traumatic. I knew my IQ because I had identified with being smart, and I had been called gifted as a child. So I'm taken out of college. I keep trying to go back. They say, you're not going to finish college. There are other things for you to do, but that's not going to work out for you. So I really struggled with this. And I have to say, having your identity taken from you, your core identity, and for me it was being smart, having that taken from you, there's nothing that leaves you feeling more powerless than that. So I felt entirely powerless. I worked and worked and worked, and I got lucky and worked and got lucky and worked. Eventually, I graduated from college. It took me 4 years longer than my peers. And I convinced someone, my angel advisor, Susan Fisk, to take me on. And so I ended up at Princeton, and I was like, I am not supposed to be here. I am an imposter. And the night before my first year talk, and the first year talk at Princeton is a 20-minute talk to 20 people. That's it. I was so afraid of being found out the next day that I called her and said, I'm quitting. She was like, you are not quitting because I took a gamble on you and you're staying. You're going to stay, and this is what you're going to do. You're going to fake it. You're going to do every talk that you ever get asked to do. You're just going to do it and do it and do it, even if you're terrified and just paralyzed and having an out-of-body experience until you have this moment where you say, oh my gosh, I'm doing it. I have become this. I am actually doing this. So that's what I did. 5 years in grad school. A few years, I'm at Northwestern. I moved to Harvard. I'm at Harvard. I'm not really thinking about it anymore, but for a long time I had been thinking, not supposed to be here, not supposed to be here. So at the end of my first year at Harvard, a student who had not talked in class the entire semester, who I had said, look, you gotta participate or else you're gonna fail, came into my office. I really didn't know her at all. And she came in totally defeated, and she said, I'm not supposed to be here. And that was the moment for me because 2 things happened. One was that I realized, oh my gosh, I don't feel like that anymore. I don't feel that anymore, but she does, and I get that feeling. And the second was, she is supposed to be here. She can fake it, she can become it. So I was like, yes, you are. You are supposed to be here, and tomorrow you're gonna fake it, you're gonna make yourself powerful, and you're gonna... and you're gonna go into the classroom, and you are gonna give the best comment ever. And she gave the best comment ever. And people turned around, they were like, oh my God, I didn't even notice her sitting there, She comes back to me months later, and I realized that she had not just faked it till she made it, she had actually faked it till she became it. So she had changed. And so I want to say to you, don't fake it till you make it. Fake it till you become it. It's not do it enough until you actually become it and internalize. The last thing I want to leave you with is this. Tiny tweaks can lead to big changes. So this is 2 minutes. 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. Before you go into the next stressful evaluative situation, For 2 minutes, try doing this in the elevator, in a bathroom stall, at your desk behind closed doors. That's what you want to do. Configure your brain to cope the best in that situation. Get your testosterone up, get your cortisol down. Don't leave that situation feeling like, oh, I didn't show them who I am. Leave that situation feeling like, oh, I really feel like I got to say who I am and show who I am. So I want to ask you first, both to try power posing, and also I want to ask you to share this science, because this is simple. I don't have ego involved in this. Give it away, share it with people, because the people who can use it the most are the ones with no resources and no technology and no status and no power. Give it to them, because they can do it in private. They need their bodies, privacy, and 2 minutes, and it can significantly change the outcomes of their life. Thank you.
Okay, so I know that it's a long video, and I appreciate everybody who stayed with me through the whole thing, and I accept that we're a little bit over time here. But I think it's very important for you to understand how nonverbal communication is important to you. And the fact that we have this ability to alter how we think about ourselves and how we think about the situation and what we communicate and how we're wired. So I hope you enjoyed that. Any of you who want the link to review that at another time, please let me know. Or else you can just Google search Amy Cuddy, TED Talk, Power Pose. It'll get you there, okay? Okay, really quickly, let's recap the highlights of the chapter. Number 1, verbal messages are the clearest when you use unequivocal, concrete language. Limit your slang, limit your jargon, limit your disfluencies. Be strategically ambiguous. Watch your inflammatory language. It matters. So watch out for biased terms and trigger words, right? Understand the difference between masculine and feminine communication styles. Understand how to switch between them. Remember that nonverbal communication is absolutely unavoidable. It's something you cannot turn off. It is taken in by all 5 of the senses, so you have to be aware of it at all time. It's multi-channeled. And remember that when in doubt, especially in the workplace, feel free to match intensity with the people you're communicating with, mirror what they are doing in order to understand how you should be acting. Thank you guys for a wonderful session this week. I hope you found it meaningful and important, and I will see you next week.